All right. Well, hello, everyone. If you were with us in January for getting started on your piece of Texas, um, all right, I was watching chat for a second. Anyway, it's great to see you all again. And if you missed it and would like to go back and watch it, I will post the links in the chat for you. And of course, feel free to share it with friends and to neighbors, and so that they can catch up and learn what you've been learning. A little intro and some housekeeping while everyone finishes logging in. I am Marvelyn Granger, president of the Fayette Prairie chapter of Native Prairie Association of Texas. And Connie Shorty is our Zoom education director, will be with us to make sure technology cooperates and to watch for your questions and your input in the chat section. So feel free to say hello in the chat. Share with us if you have a prairie and what county it's in, and you can drop all of that into the chat. And a brief intro of NPAT. NPAT has been working since 1986 to protect and share for care for prairies and share responsibilities with neighbors through conservation, stewardship, and community. Right now, NPAT is conserving over 7,000 acres of native prairie across Texas. And this is in addition to the private land protected by landowners and members like you. Our Fayette Prairie chapter members care a lot about saving prairies through stewardship and education. And I welcome you to join our chapter community if you've not already, or of course, to renew your membership. I will leave links for you in the chat so you can be sure to connect to education and support here in your neighborhood, not just in Fayette County, but also the 10 surrounding counties. Tonight, Chase Brooke will continue our series by offering resources for accessing information and finding experts to guide you. Be sure to mark your calendar now for the third in the series, which will be July 14th, and learn how to identify, plan, and manage multiple goals and objectives on your land. You are already registered. If you missed the first presentation or want to rewatch or share any of them, they are recorded and posted on our website, and I'll add that link as well. This series will conclude with an in-person class and a land tour capstone on September 18th in Brenham. Space for that, however, is limited and not connected to your registration for these Zooms. So if you are interested in attending those tours and visiting in person with Chase, be sure to register for that so that you can save your spot. And that link with our upcoming workshops and tours will also be in the chat for you. Lastly, Chase will utilize remaining time at the conclusion of this presentation to answer any questions that you have. So add them as you think of them so you don't forget what they were. Put those in the chat. He'll keep an eye on them and visit with us at the end. So let's get started. Chase is a small acreage program specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. He holds degrees in spatial science and ecosystem science and management, and is currently pursuing a doctorate in rangeland wildlife and fisheries management. Chase served as agriculture and natural resource agent in Collin County, and he's worked on his family ranch, has experience in rangeland and small acreage land management. And as you visit with Chase this evening, you can't miss noting his genuine passion and commitment to not only his job, but land stewardship and working directly with people who own land. So Chase, welcome back.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as well. Because like a good government employee, my PowerPoint and slide deck is like a safety blanket. And so if I don't have it nicely wrapped around me, I just get all sorts of nervous. But yeah, so first off, thanks. I'm excited to have a chance to come in again and continue talking about just some of these foundational concepts in land management, right? Whether you're a new landowner, whether you've owned land for 10, 20 years, you grew up on the family ranch, wherever you're coming from, I think it's always, good to really think about where are we getting our information? How are we accessing not just the knowledge we need to be successful, but who do we go to? How do we engage with a community that helps us learn and grow and be better stewards of our landscape? Um, Also, just, if you don't mind too, for those of you who are active in the chat, before I started my slide deck, I saw some of y'all were typing in. If you're able or you would like, feel free to share. If you attended the previous one as well? I'm curious how many people will have kind of following along with the breadcrumb of presentations. And if this is your first one to jump in, welcome. So yes, taking it from the top. Like I said, today is all about how we access information and resources, right? And that information could be knowledge, it could be facts, it could be, advice, and resources, include those knowledge resources, but also potentially where do we go to access things like funding, technical assistance, and more quantitative assistance with our property, right? And if you were here on the last one, you've learned that I like learning objectives. They help me, think through what I want to put together on a PowerPoint, but it also helps you, the participant, understand what we're going to cover, right? So today, the three main points we're going to be going through is just first and foremost, as a landowner and a land steward, what is your role in securing knowledge, resources, and assistance in land management, right? We're also going to talk through what the role and interactions between the numerous different agencies and consultants and contractors and all these different people who are involved in conservation and land management, but don't necessarily live or work the property like you do, but are available to help. And then last, we're going to wrap up talking through, how as land stewards, we get involved in, our broader conservation community, right? And so that's going to be a quick run through on, how we get involved through landowner conservation associations, and professional and advocacy groups and things like that. And so we're going to get started. Like I said, so the first thing we're going to go through is really where do we find information, right? So without even thinking of all the other people out there, don't worry about the agencies, don't worry about those landowner groups, just at its most basic, where do we go for information, right? And where do we go to learn and to figure out what we need to know? Because this information access really is oftentimes one of the most critical, components of land ownership and land stewardship, right? And specifically, it's, the gaps we have in our knowledge. As a landowner and as a land steward, and I'm sure this is something that, many of us have gone through. It takes a lot, right? As a landowner, you're not just a biologist. You're not, if you have livestock, guess what? You're an animal scientist, you're a forage scientist, you got to know soil science. Even if it's just to a surface or trivial degree, there's a certain amount of chemistry and biology and all these other components that come in and create this knowledge base of which we make our decisions, right? And, understanding where those gaps are, really, honestly, that's the first step, right? And I can tell you, I mean, yeah, I've got degrees. I'm a specialist in, small acreage and wildlife management. And even then, I'd be the first to tell you, I am not a wildlife biologist. I am a habitat guy, right? I'm a range guy. I'm a plant guy. If you were to ask me, what's the reproductive timing of raccoons or armadillos, or how do specific mammal biology, I ain't your guy, right? That's a gap in my knowledge, but I understand that. When I understand that, that means I know first and foremost, is this something that I need to learn more about? Is this something that maybe I don't need to know about, but I can reach out to someone who does and get kind of the Cliff Notes version? Being able to identify where those gaps are then lets us figure out where to focus our learning, right? And yes, the second bullet point is that a land steward should have a yearning for learning. I just like the way that sounded verbally, so I wrote it in the PowerPoint, but it's true, right? there's always something to learn, and it could be something big, it could be something small, but whether it's advances in science, advances in management, or even just exposing ourselves to thinking about the way we manage our land and how, going to other talks and rifling around in their slides and figuring out what fits our management styles or not. Having a desire to accumulate knowledge is, I think, really what makes successful land ownership journeys thrive. As soon as we decide that we know everything, I can promise you, fate, God, the land itself is going to laugh in your face and give you something that you will never have thought of and you've never expected. And that's just a part of the way it goes, right? And so keeping an open mind, I think, really, really helps. And we all bring our own strengths. Especially when I work with new landowners, I am working with incredibly intelligent people, right? You don't get to be a landowner and you don't buy land if you're not successful in some way, shape, form, or fashion. I mean, frankly, right? And so instead, it's not a matter of, if we're intelligent or how intelligent we are, it's how do we apply the knowledge we have, right? If you are the world's best accountant, how can I as an educator, but you as an accountant landowner, apply the principles of land management in a way that click with the knowledge you have and the understanding you have to ease that transfer of knowledge and ease that absorption of what we're learning. Because the knowledge we bring to the table today is our starting point, right? And I always would encourage people, run down those rabbit trails, right? If you see something interesting or you have a thought of, oh, well, why is it that when we're grazing a pasture, they say take half, leave half? What does that mean, right? Run down that rabbit trail. I'm a big fan of, I call them wiki safaris, right? I'm reading something on Wikipedia and I come across a term I've never heard and there's a blue link on it. Well, I'm going to click it and I'm going to learn. And then I'm going to learn about something else and maybe I'll end up going down that trail 3 or 4 times. But it means that I've accumulated new knowledge that has helped my understanding of that initial topic. And I think Donald Rumsfeld put it really well. You may have heard of his known knowns speech, but really the idea is, we have known knowns, right? The things we know are the things we know, right? We also know that there are known unknowns and that we know there are things we don't know. But there's the unknown unknowns that we don't know that we don't know. And honestly, that's where we start getting in trouble. Because if we know something, right? And if we know we don't know something, it's easy to then go, it's like, oh, well, okay, I'm not a mammal biologist, but if someone asks me a, swine health question, I can go and do a little bit of, I know I don't know it, but maybe I know the right words and I could do a quick Google search and educate myself to the level I need to be to answer this question. But if I don't know what I don't know, that's where we start getting in trouble, right? That's where we start, finding out the hard way that there are things maybe we should have learned. And so the whole goal, I would say the whole goal of this series, more than anything else, is to expose everyone to the things that hopefully you don't know that you didn't know, right? I never expect anyone to leave a talk. If you leave my talk and you know anything and everything, and you've committed every single fact and concept and slide to heart, and you'll remember it for the rest of your days, you have a much better memory than I do. But most of the time, my goal is to give everyone sitting in this Zoom meeting or in one of my workshops just the concepts and the vocabulary to then be able to investigate later, right? You might not remember what I say when I talk about stocking rates, but you might remember the term stocking rate and that it has to deal with grazing. And then you can go Google that and find some authoritative sources to do that deep dive and learning later on as well. Or maybe go ask that local expert, conservation expert or your neighbor or whatnot. And it kind of goes with this next talk. And I know I'm starting this on a downer, but I think it's also very much being realistic, right? We make mistakes, right? Especially when we come into those unknown unknowns. We live in an imperfect knowledge space, and that means we make mistakes. It happens. Happens to me. Happens to me all the time. Ask my wife. I mess up, right? We all do. We're humans. Ain't nobody perfect. But so I think when it comes to land management and how we think about the information we're getting and what do we need to know and what do we need to learn and how do we bring together all these different concepts and ideas, really to me, it's not about preventing every mistake because we can't, right? We're not going to prevent every mistake. We're not going to be able to escape the fact that sometimes crap happens. Instead, to me, it's the goal is let's reduce the potential for catastrophe when we do make a mistake, right? If I'm going to fail, I want to fail easily and land on my feet, right? Because it's going to happen. And if I know that I'm going to fail eventually at something, how can I hedge that risk in a manner that allows me to recuperate, and exceed that initial starting point afterwards? And really, oftentimes, a lot of mistakes. I was thinking through how to put this, but the first one is a lot of times, if we know what we know and we know the things that we need to know and what we need to do, oftentimes a lot of mistakes are just down to we get busy and we get rushed or a lot of stuff's going on. And so we just kind of make a decision and run with it and hope it's the right one. Yeah. And obviously these are broad overgeneralizations, right? But generally it comes down to we know what we need to know. It's just we implemented it poorly. Similarly, we also a lot of mistakes can come from a poor understanding, right? So we know, like we know what we know. Maybe we knew what we did. Like I knew that I didn't know much about equine health, and but I was in a situation where I had to do something, and again, I know I didn't know what the best deal was, but I had to make a decision. And then sometimes you have those unexpected impacts, right? I didn't know to expect this, and it's just coming out of the blue and smacking me in the face, right? And each of these can have small impacts. They can have large ones. They can be mild. They can be catastrophes. It runs the gamut. But I think oftentimes when new landowner talks and small acreage landowner, I mean, heck, just landowner talks in general are given. There's a lot of, I would say, the sunshine and rainbows and everything's great. And if you do these three steps, everything's going to be perfect. But I think there's also a place for kind of the reality of like, hey, when it's going great, it's going great. But sometimes, mistakes happen, right? Whether it's something I meant to or not. We burned a pasture in February of 2022, and then it didn't rain for 14 months. And we lost some soil from wind erosion. And we had other stuff happen that came in on it. Is that a mistake in a certain way? Yeah. I mean, if I knew what I know now, I probably wouldn't have burned then. Is there any way I could have changed, at the time, changed what I did with the information I had? Oh, goodness, no. Right. So what do? Well, we roll with it. When it started raining, we adapted. Maybe we're not going to burn as big of a pasture. And then that way, if we do get a sudden onset drought, we aren't having as many acres impacted at a single time. So, setbacks happen, but, the more we know that they're going to happen and the more information, the better setup we are for it, the easier it is to bounce back. And so where do we go for information, right? And these are, there's a quote in the graph, and the graph on the right, I'm going to talk through first. And this was a survey we did earlier this year. I say we, myself, and the Texas Water Resources Institute sent a survey out to 525 new and beginning landowners, so less than 10 years of experience on the farm or ranch. One of the questions we asked them, question 24, if you're wondering what that Q24 was at the start of every single line, was where do you go for info? Where do you get the information you use to make management decisions? And so if you look at the graph, everything in gray is just like they sometimes go there. If it's yellowy brown, that means they rarely or never use that resource. And if it's green blue, then that means they often or always use it, right? So more green means they're more likely to use that source. More yellow means that they're less likely to use that source. And so you can see that the highest one out of all of these are friends and family members, right? Which makes sense. As human beings, we are hardwired to when we go to people or sources that have high trust levels for information, right? if your grandfather ranched for 50 years before, passing it down to your parents or you, if you go to him for advice, you're going to trust his advice, right? And those family members, your neighbors, all of those are high trust, and generally high relevancy sources of information. Um, Similarly, a lot of people go to, government websites and bulletins. I was surprised to see people enjoyed reading scientific papers that much. I mean, I have to do it for my job, and I guess I work in quasi academia, and so I'm used to that sort of punishment. But, for those of you who enjoy reading scientific papers, those can be a good resource. Workshops, classes, books. And so there's a lot of different ways that we get our information and a lot of different sources that we get them from. And the quote on the left was interesting to me. This came out of a focus group that I did with some colleagues of mine at A&M. And really, a lot of it comes down to, this was a new landowner talking about their experiences in getting information and where they got their knowledge of ranching. And it was, trying to, the landowner was talking about learning through the available resources, listening to the old timers, and recognizing that it's not always the best resource, but you make do with what you have. You're in a as I said before, you're in a situation where you have to make choices. So you do the best you can with the most and going to the people, going to the information who have that source and, rifle through it and use the bits you can use. And so from there, and I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to tell you where to or not to go for resources. I mean, I'll have suggestions, but I think really what I wanted to talk about here was just how do we separate good information from bad, right? And I'm putting it this way because I'm not here to cast judgment. To a certain degree, I don't really care where you get your information from, as long as you're able to thoughtfully consider it and how it applies to your situation to help you make good and effective management decisions, right? I mean, of course, I would prefer you go to extension and stuff like that, but realistically, I know that not everyone does that. I mean, heck, even I don't. So what separates good information from bad, right? To me, good information is relevant to your situation, right? It is fairly impartial. It, both in the sense of that mentions there are downsides as well as benefits. Very few, if no things have only benefits and no downsides of any kind. It's relatively objective and impartial, and is basing itself on known science or experience, right? So again, and that's kind of the difference between listening to your grandfather tell you about his experiences ranching versus your, nephew's friend from school who, saw a YouTube video once, right? The more directly we can connect that information with the person who had that experience, I think the more relevant that is, and the better you can determine how that applies to your property, right? I think poor sources of information really, a lot of times it's not relevant to where you are. And I'll be the first to say that, often, and I would say this is even, extension bulletins, right? You great science-based resource. But I worked with a lavender farm when I was a county agent for a while. Great people. They had a cool little farm. It was 5 acres covered in lavender, smelled absolutely wonderful. And I went out there one day on a farm visit because they were having some issues with plant propagation and plants dying. And so I was going out to help them figure out the root cause, if you pardon the pun. And through this conversation, it came out that they had a mentor, and that mentor was great. But his experience growing lavender was from growing lavender in Washington State. So, nothing wrong with that. The guy is very experienced. He knows his stuff, knows his lavender. But the way he grows his lavender in Washington State is going to be very different than how we have to grow it in Anna, Texas, right? Just by virtue of how, the amount it rains is different. Our temperature extremes are different. The soils are different. right? And so, generally speaking, the further we get from where we are, the hard, especially when we're talking about specific management decisions, how much do we graze? What species are present? Those sorts of decisions, the further we get from where we are, the more likely we are to get either non-relevant information at best or potentially damaging information, right? If you have management practices recommended assuming you get rain, well, in Texas, that's going to set you up for a very rough time because about 60% of the time we get less than our average rainfall. So, um, I would also say, when I see bad information come around, a lot of times it's misrepresenting benefits or costs. And that could be, again, saying everything is wonderful and there are no downsides. It could be, any number of other, I think, statements about how a practice would work. And I would say, and this is one where I would say the social media effect sometimes is real. And you see this a lot, not, and the idea isn't just in land management, but it's like if you're only ever seeing on social media other people's bests, it makes it really hard to figure out how your property looks and get it, it sets false beauty standards in a certain sense. So always keep that in mind. I think similarly, the more that someone or some source of information is appealing more to emotion than knowledge is, again, it's not necessarily a red flag, like a danger, don't go there in and of itself, but it does always make me think that, okay, why are they trying to get me emotionally charged? Right. Especially if they're trying to sell me something. Why are they trying to get me emotionally charged? And is that the state that I want to be in when I make my management decisions? Right. Because ideally, and I know, again, human beings are imperfect. We all make decisions based on emotion, probably more than logic, and that's reality. But I mean, in an ideal world, it would be good. There's a certain amount of, okay, we have to think about from an objective standpoint what fits best, right? If the problem I have on my property requires a square peg, am I going to just shove a triangle shaped one in there and hope for the best because I really love triangles, or should I search around for a square? And then sometimes you just find stuff that is factually untrue. I'm I'm not going to be getting any laundry lists out or naming and shaming or anything like that because that's just not how I work. But there's bad information and then there's just straight up lying. And so just be aware of that, right? And and in that regard, I would say, generally speaking, good sources of information are good places to start. A lot of agencies have bulletins or publications. Those tend to be good. Yes. And the reason I like those or put them forward is they tend to be fairly approachable from, as far as like, working paper publications and stuff go. Oftentimes they're written for a producer audience and they're, I try very hard to make my publications very approachable and digestible by the end user. And so that could be from groups like AgriLife Extension or another state cooperative extension service. Groups like Southern SARE, if you're not familiar with them, they're part of USDA that do a lot of producer or landowner focused research and cooperative practice development. They put out really good publications. The USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, where NRCS really works well. And I don't know that I have it in this slide deck. They have specifications for just about any conservation practice you want. If you want to know how to build a barbed wire fence and build a barbed wire fence that's going to last you at least 50 to 100 years, NRCS has a spec that will guarantee that. If you wanted to know how to do, plant a cover crop for erosion control in the winter, they've got a spec for that. So they can be really good for technical specifications. Like I said earlier, when in doubt, the more that information is produced closer to where you are, the better. And to give you an example, like Oklahoma State University, as much as it galls me to say this as a Texan, they've got certain publications and resources that just fly circles around what we do in AgriLife Extension, right? And every state kind of has their own specialty. I mean, and to this day, the best over introduction to soils, pub bulletins from a cooperative extension service are from Pennsylvania. And they did a really good job, and it's better than anything we have. But it's also a good example that, you know what, doesn't really matter that it's from Pennsylvania. The physical and chemical properties of soil are the same, right? As a conceptual idea. Now, if you were to ask me, how do we manage soils in Texas? I would say go to a resource that is based out of Texas, not Pennsylvania, because we have very different soils. But if it's just like, hey, what is this concept or what's this idea, then it doesn't really matter as much. Lots of NGOs also tend to put out materials and publications. I always say this with the caveat that, remember, every group has its own kind of focus area. And so the more that we are, the more that we learn from their materials within that focus area, it's generally going to be fairly relevant, as long as we're kind of sticking to that lane. And the picture on the right, I'm just a shameless plug. This is an example of a new landowner resource and reference guide I published 2 years ago now. And so it's just, it's available as as an example of an extension bulletin. It's a PDF. You can download it. You have access to it on your computer. This one gives a list of information and resources on different agencies and groups you can work with, things that we're going to talk about in the next section. But I figured I'd put it here so you had a little visual of what that might look like. All right, and then verifying information, right? So we talked about good information, bad information. What are some good sources? And I think kind of the last deal is, verifying what is being presented to us, right? And I think the biggest thing is just don't be afraid to be skeptical and ask questions, right? I mean, I don't care where it comes from. Even if it's something I'm saying, if you disagree with what I have to say about good information, bad information, that's fine, right? Ask yourself the question, like, is this, what is making me kind of skeptical, right? If something doesn't maybe sound right the first time you see it or hear it, sometimes there's a reason we have a gut instinct, and a couple guiding questions here, is this from a resource I trust? Is there any way to validate the information that I'm seeing or that's being presented to me? If I follow these recommendations and it goes poorly, what's that potential downside? And is this based on actual experience or hearsay, right? When in doubt, again, ask questions, take it to friends, take it to colleagues, take it to your county extension agent. Like, hey, I've heard this. I've heard that if I paint all my fence posts yellow, I will never have another mosquito on my property. That something tells me that's BS. Have you heard anything about this? And your friend might tell you, no, that's just straight up old wives' tale, or I don't know where you heard that from. That's a lie. Fair enough, right? Or sometimes it's like, hey, how do I get rid of Johnson grass? I don't want to spray it. Well, then it's like, hey, well, you could graze it, you could do other things. Like, again, use that network, use those people around you. And kind of the last thing I'll say here is just also remember the plural of anecdote is not data, right? Those experiences are great. Knowing how other people have done things is really good. Also remember, I mean, unless, I would love to be corrected on this, and I wish we were in a society with more common, but most people are much more comfortable sharing the things that went really well than the things that went poorly. And so as we hear other people's experiences, let's also remember that, because it worked well for someone doesn't necessarily mean it'll work well for us as we try different things. Again, maybe I should have put this on here on the slide, but if you're on the recording or you're listening to me, you'll get it anyway. Hedging that risk, right? If we're trying something new, or, if I have 100 acres of whatever, and I want to try something new, am I going to do it on all 100 acres up front? If I do, and it goes poorly, am I losing all 100 acres of productivity? What's that downside? Or maybe if I'm trying something new, am I going to do it on 5 acres or 10% of that property? And I'm going to test it out first and see how I like it. Maybe, different ways of approaching things like that allow us to, if there's something we're really interested in and we want to try, we can do so without necessarily, betting the farm on it. And so, then we take all this information, and as landowners, I guess, we talked about how we fit into this picture. How do we know? How do we learn? What kinds of information do we get? And now we're going to take this information and how do we take this with us as land stewards when we work with natural resource professionals, right? Because when we go out in our community, we have lots of natural resource professionals. We have peers and colleagues and all sorts of folks that we can engage with, to get information, to get advice, some groups have cost share funding, et cetera. How do we best make the time we have with those folks, right? Oftentimes, kind of three main ways that those interactions go. It's through direct communication, emails, phone calls. I used to get a lot more when I was a county extension agent. I think I would top out at about 1,200 a month, emails and phone calls. I don't get that many now, but I still get emails from landowners and folks who are asking questions and information. Sometimes that then leads to an office visit, or maybe that's a Zoom or Teams meeting where we're sitting down and addressing, kind of having more of a conversation to answer a question or issue. And then there's a farmer ranch visit, right? And all of those, I ordered those in order of kind of the most simple and straightforward to the more complicated. But oftentimes it's really, those I think are the three main interface points in how landowners engage with natural resource professionals, especially on the agency side. I will also say, just understand, especially when we talk about office visits, but particularly farm and ranch visits for folks like your county agent, parks and wildlife biologist, those schedules book up quickly. I know, like, especially when I was a county agent, I was booking people probably a month or more in advance, just because most weeks I had 1 day a week where I could do farm visits if I was lucky. And even then I could maybe do 2. And so, if that's something you're really jonesing for, get on that list, get on that calendar, understand it might not be immediate. At the same time, you might be able to get an office visit or a Zoom visit or a phone call scheduled a lot more quickly than that. And it's not because we don't want to talk to people or we don't want to see your property. It's just like, honestly, that's the fun part of the job. Getting to talk to people and see land and look at grass and plants and animals and stuff, that's fun, right? But, honestly, that's maybe 5 or 10% of the overall job. So just, a little bit of patience and understanding helps a lot. And then I would say it goes into how, if we're working with these professionals, and especially if we're scheduling office or farm visits, being prepared helps so much. Like I cannot tell you how much it helps. Especially, in the context of most of the time you get about an hour in their office or in the field. And so you need to make the most of that time. And in my book, are we going to spend of that hour, especially because it usually seems to be in August and it's 104 degrees outside, and I've got boots on the ground on your property. Are we going to spend that hour sitting under a mesquite tree, sweating our butts off, talking through, like, what are your goals? What would you like to do with the property? Or are we going to go around that ranch and we're going to look at, we're going to talk about issues and, address the problems you have, right? Because honestly, in my opinion, there's a lot of that stuff that we can do either beforehand as homework or in the air conditioning. For me, farm visits are very much for things we can point at. What is this weed? Why is there erosion here? How can I make this cow not look so skinny? And so oftentimes, like, and it's not like some of the prep work is particularly challenging, but just thinking through, going into it, hey, what's your property? What's the address? Especially if you want someone to go to your property, we do need the address. You would be surprised how many times we have to chase that down. But just how many acres do you have? What are your land use goals, right? We talked about this a little bit beforehand, in the previous talk, but what's the management history? How did what's been done to the property to get it here today? And you can always ask, and I would encourage you, ask what information they need ahead of time. Because the more that the more information that you can give that natural resource professional, the better they can then do their homework, right? If I knew I was going out somewhere to look at erosion issues, I could take a minute and look at a watershed map. I'll look at satellite imagery of the property. I can do a number of different things that help me get the information I need prepped up so that when I'm out there looking at your farm or ranch, I'd have the answers for you, ideally. So not again, just one of those deals that a little prep goes a long way. And then beyond just that direct interfacing with the natural resource professional, I would also say that workshops and conferences and educational events. I mean, heck, I mean y'all are here, right? You're here in this talk for a reason, because the title and the topic that you saw here is something that you were interested in learning more about. Right. And these talks and these presentations and workshops and conferences are that is your opportunity to do a deep dive, but especially to ask questions. Right. And, some workshops are free, some have a monetary cost. I would always say that the value, is X price for a workshop worth it, comes down to entirely your perceived value of it. Especially, considering like oftentimes we're providing meal, like when I'm charging, a fee for a workshop, I'm trying to make sure you get your money's worth. I want you to have food. I want you to have all the materials. I want you to have everything you need to feel like you got your money's worth out of it. Not everything has a cost. You're learning, and learning about these events coming up, just being plugged in on newsletters. Honestly, I know it's really boring and nobody likes getting spammed with a ton of emails, but your county agent probably has a newsletter with upcoming events, your NRCS office, Soil Water Conservation District, social media pages. We'll put out press releases, but those tend to be, they're on the front page for a day and then they leave. I know Extension and other folks have some public event calendars as well. But I think in the big picture, and we were actually talking about this before the talk today, the biggest benefit of these workshops and conferences, and especially the in-person events, but even the online ones, is just, again, it's asking the chance to ask questions. You've got me captive on here. I have this whole time blocked off until 7:30. If we wrap up at 7 and no one has questions, cool, go home, put my son to bed, maybe read a book for a little bit, and that's great. But I'm also specifically putting time aside to answer your questions, right? And I will tell you right now, yes, I will answer questions about this talk. But if you just have any land management questions or anything like, hey, what's the best way to kill a crabapple tree growing out of my driveway or something, like, shoot, ask me, right? I'm here for it. Again, that's kind of the fun part of the job. And then also, especially the in-person events, is the networking, right? And yes, you're listening to the expert or multiple experts talk about their topics, but it's the person you might be sitting next to might have a property just down the road from you, or maybe they've had a property management experience that you can learn from, or maybe you just both knit and you really like to talk about knitting and you just made a knitting friend, right? I think people undervalue the social benefits of these workshops and conferences and events. And so I always like to encourage it. I know it's not always as easy and it's a little more of a hassle to drive somewhere and take the time away, but I mean, I will also say I'm a little bit biased as someone who puts on a lot of these workshops. So you take it for what you will, right? All right. So what did we talk to up to this point? We talked through a lot of this was from you as a landowner and as a land steward. What is your role? Your role is to learn, hopefully, to learn from good information, ideally, to figure out how to better work with the professionals around you, and to find different ways of getting the information you need, right? So all the talking I did up to this point It just summed up in 4 bullet points. But hey, that's how it goes. So real quick, going to talk about agencies, consultants, and contractors, right? Um, and this part's going to be a little bit quicker just because it's a little more fact-y and less philosophically. Um, and I think the first thing to point out is just as a landowner and as a land steward, you are at a nexus of information, right? There are agencies, there are groups, there are folks out there whose whole job it is to help you, right? Whether that is through information, whether that is through financial assistance programs, whether even it's just through, hey, I don't know who the right person for this is, but can you point me in the right direction, right? There are a tremendous number of resources and people available to you to help. I will say though, there is no one-stop shop. There is no one person you can call that can answer your questions. There is no one agency that can fund everything you want. We live and work and manage land in a as a interconnected network of agencies and groups and organizations, right? And so I say that also to bring up that generally speaking, we're all friends, right? Like, especially at that county and community level. When I was in Collin County, yes, I was a county extension agent, but I knew and had the direct line to my district conservationist with the USDA, with our parks and wildlife biologist, our saltwater conservation district, the biggest pecan producer in the county. Like, if you needed to get a hold of someone, I could probably point you towards them, even if I was not the right guy to talk to, right? And once a month I would get lunch with the Farm Service Agency and NRCS, and all we would do is we'd get lunch, typically go eat some cheap Tex-Mex and talk about, hey, what's going on in the county? What programs is Extension putting on? What's coming up? Are there any upcoming disaster relief programs through USDA? Whatever, right? And so you'll often find, you might call one office and they answer a part of your question and then shuffle you, send you over to another agency. But honestly, that's the system we've got. And it's not because we don't want to talk to you. Again, it's just that, not everyone is the best fit for everything. And especially when we think about our federal partners, but most government agencies in general, law, legal, like law and statute says that we are to do X. And so X is what we do, especially the federal agencies. By God, if Congress said that they are a square peg, they are a square peg. They will not pretend to be a circle peg. They will not be a triangle peg. They will not be a square peg. They will not be a rectangle peg. They will be a square peg, and they will do square peg things, right? And again, and it's not because the staff or the employees don't want to do other stuff. It's just, unfortunately, that's their area and that's what they work in. But even as a state agency, I'll tell you, in AgriLife Extension, we have information, we have bulletins, we have knowledge to share, but I ain't got no money, right? And it doesn't matter how much I want to give you money, I ain't got no money to share. So, but if you were looking for cost share programs for conservation, even if I don't have money, tell you what, well, go talk to NRCS. Maybe they have a conservation program going on that can cost share some activities. Maybe Texas Parks and Wildlife, or the Texas A&M Forest Service might have ongoing programs that you could apply to. And I would say, and again, just kind of on the prep side, as a landowner and land steward, you don't have to know everything about everyone, but the more you have a very general idea about who does what, helps that conversation a lot. And just again, in terms of even if you call me and say, Chase, I know you're not the guy who handles any kind of financial programs for landowners. I know you don't do that. Can you point me to someone who does? Because I want to graze South American alpaca on organic oats or something like that. I don't know. Like that I cannot describe to you how much that helps. And even within that too, understand that we all have our own expertise, especially when we get to areas like, again, cooperative extension. The county extension agent, is responsible for knowing a little bit of everything. When I was in Collin County as the Ag and Natural Resources agent, I literally was the point person for anything that was not youth leadership development related, that was not human health related, and that was not nutrition. If we had flooding in the county, people would call me. If someone's cow was sick, I would get phone calls. If their fence was down, I want to know how to fence it, I would get phone calls. If someone, saw a bunch of new purple flowers on the side of the road and wanted to know if it was a noxious weed, I would get those phone calls, right? Some of those are in my realm of expertise, some are not. Some of you may have experiences with county agents where, if you love prairies, you want to know prairies, but that county agent comes from an animal science background. Fair enough, right? That happens. And but I think recognizing, okay, and from the professional side and also y'all's side, it's like, okay, cool. If Chase is not a beef cattle nutritionist, cool. He knows that he can get me in touch with someone who is, and we can facilitate that transfer, but we're not banking the farm on me knowing your animal nutrition question off the drop of a pin. Again, I know I've emphasized this already, but the biggest deal is just we are here to help. We want to help you. We want you to be successful. We want you to do the best you can with the land you have to the outcome you want. And so the more that everyone is on the same page and the more that we're prepared and can approach it together, the easier it all goes. All right, now we get to the laundry list. So and I'm not going to spend tons of time here because one, this isn't that publication I told you about earlier, and two, it's more of just making you aware that these exist. If you are aware of these folks, awesome. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, so I'm not going to lose you. If you haven't heard of them before, this is your opportunity to Google or to jot them down. So first things first, on the regulatory side, so these are the people who enforce laws. They often give advice and they can do technical assistance stuff, but they also have the ability to actually these have the authority to make people do things or tell people they cannot. It's like Texas Department of Agriculture. They're a regulatory agency. They oversee pesticides, agriculture, pest regulation, prescribed fire, a number of other deals, right? They have funding opportunities in terms of cost sharing and grants and low cost loans that are available to landowners. Always like to point people to them, especially from the funding side, but also if you have a pesticide, if you're wondering, hey, do I need a license to spray X? These are the folks who give out the licenses. TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, most of the time hopefully they're no one you have to interact with, but they do air water quality management. So if you're wondering, can I burn today? And it's a ozone action day, then that, they're the ones who follow the regulatory guidelines and say, no, you cannot burn on that day. Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board. So they do broad water quality and watershed management, flood retarding structures. They also, of these, the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board also oversees all your local soil water conservation districts, which are based in counties and watersheds. Most counties are covered by an SWCD. They can be awesome resources as well. Texas Parks and Wildlife, oftentimes, so yes, game wardens, but also your district biologists, urban biologists, and and other folks. They do regulate wildlife, hunting, fishing, etc., but they can be a tremendous resource for you and your property as well. And if any of you recognize the fella wearing the TPWD hat with the camera, that's Sam Kieschnick, who is he's one of the urban biologists for Texas Parks and Wildlife up in Dallas, and he is an excellent human being. Doesn't matter, that has nothing to do with the laundry list of agencies. I just want to give him a shout out. So on the non-regulatory side, like I said, we have our soil water conservation districts. I always encourage people, know your county central appraisal district. I know that sometimes the CAD can be a bit of a bad word, but like for instance, with your ag or wildlife valuation for your property taxes, if you want someone who can tell you black and white if something does or does not qualify, they're the only people who can do so. They can also be a tremendous resource in that regard and helping connect you with information. The Texas A&M Forest Service, they are more than just forestry. They are forestry and wildfires and conservation as well. And I would also point out that State Comptroller, if any of y'all are not familiar with the farm or timber tax exemption. That's a sales tax exemption for agricultural and timber production. If your property qualifies, that can get you get you exempted from sales taxes on farm and ranch goods. So always like to throw that in there. Um, and because I'm definitely biased for the maroon and white team, AgriLife Extension gets its own slide because I can. And really, the biggest thing with Extension is we are an educational agency with offices that cover all 254 counties. So we have two sets of, there are 4 counties where 2 counties are sharing an office. We oversee, and again, I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with like the 4-H program, Master Gardener, Master Naturalist programs, but predominantly we are an education agency who's charged with really translating the research outcomes into usable and applicable management practices for your property. And again, I would also say Extension, what it's really good at is we know people, right? If you're uncertain who to talk to, your county extension agent is very likely to know who that right person is. All right, on the federal agency, USDA is the big one. I mean, really, U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a little bit of stuff and some programs, but the USDA is kind of the big player here. They oversee regulatory and non-regulatory agencies. The highlights of which I put down here: Farm Service Agency, they're the ones who I always consider them, they're the gateway to USDA programs. Yes, they have insurance, they do financing on, farmland and stuff, but the big deal is the farm number, right? So that's going in and basically certifying that you own or have legal authority to manage a property. And that's what can open the door to funding programs and other things like that through USDA. Natural Resources Conservation Service, they are the technical assistance and cost share folks, right? So their job is to help producers implement conservation practices, whether that's their technical assistance. They can help write you conservation plans, seed blends for cover crops. The amount ebbs and flows, but they generally have some cost share programs running throughout the year. Always encourage, know your district conservationist. USDA Rural Development, again, kind of an undermentioned group, but they have grants and funding for rural communities, right? And oftentimes that can include, in years past, I've seen things from, yes, for rural businesses, but farms and ranches qualified for cost share, low interest loans on things like inputting solar panels in for power production on farms that did not have access to electricity otherwise, or wells or well development, or again, the programs they have are constantly cycling in and out, but they do tend to have different things that may or may not fit your farm or ranch operation. And again, it's one of those, if you know to look and you can find it, but if you don't know they exist, it's hard to get access to those opportunities. The National Agricultural Statistics Service, they don't have money, but what they do is they oversee a lot of the information and statistics, right? So if you were wondering, hey, how many landowners in Texas have been farming or ranching for less than 10 years? Or how many ranches or farms are owned or managed by a woman rather than a man, right? Or what's the average production of, what's the average corn yield in Brazos County? Those are all, that's where you would go to find a lot of that basic information, especially when we think about the agricultural productivity side. SARE is one I mentioned too. I talked about it earlier, and that's where, they do research, but it's all in cooperation with local landowners, and they are laser focused on research and education to landowners for landowners, right? They have a lot of information and resources out there. I highly encourage y'all to look it up, especially when it comes to sustainable agricultural production and conservation. They are top notch. All right, outside the agencies, I know we don't always talk a lot about consultants and contractors, but they can be a huge resource for what you do, right? Especially most of the agencies I talked about, we all fall in the category of what I call, we are all professional advice givers, right? I don't work for the part of the government that gets to tell you what to do. But I can give you advice on what I think you should do based on the circumstances, but I can't write you a management plan. I don't have the authority or the ability to do something like that. But if that's a situation you're in or something you're looking for, that's where those consultants can be incredibly helpful. Um, you know, I would say contractors as well, right? They have a very specific niche. I need some service done and I can't, won't, or don't have the ability to do it myself, right? Those contractors are able to take that workload off your plate. They can also serve, consultants and contractors both can serve as sounding boards and provide expert advice. For both of them, I would always encourage people work with people who are from or work in your area, right? Like everything else, the closer we are working to the land we manage or steward, the better transferability that knowledge and information has. And especially with, and I would say with both, don't be afraid to set specifications based on your goals, right? If you want things done a certain way, don't be afraid to tell them. For example, I'm one of the leading guys in Texas, experts in Texas on brush pile building. Oftentimes, most of the time, landowners get windrows or giant brush piles on their properties because that wasn't something they specified to their contractor. You can tell them don't build any piles bigger than your skid steer, right? And that's a condition of the contractual, hiring of that group. But in the absence of that, they will use their expert judgment to do what they think is best or most convenient. I will also say not every office does, but many county extension offices or NRCS offices have lists of consultants or contractors. I will say those are usually anyone who wants to be on them can be. I work for the state government. I cannot endorse or recommend any one private company or individual over another. But if you were looking for a list of people who you could work with, that would be a good start. That's also where knowing your neighbors and things like that can come in handy to tell you that, yeah, Ted's really good, or don't work with Bill. He lit my field on fire. And then that kind of segues into the last section, right? Landowner conservations and conservation associations and professional organizations. And really what this is, and I like to call this, it's about our community of conservation, right? When we think about stewardship and land management, most of the time we think about what's going on within our fence lines. And I think I talked about this a little bit at the end of the last talk I gave in January. But, to me, taking a moment to engage with these communities of conservation is how we really grow the impact of what we do and our management practices beyond just what happens within our fence lines, but also helps connect us to peers, to experts, and to resources beyond what we have on our farm or ranch as well, right? And I think, to me, the best example of these is really these landowner conservation associations, right? And this is local groups, local grassroots organizations of local landowners formed around a specific need, right? Generally speaking, these are things like prescribed burn associations, landowners getting together to help provide pool manpower and equipment to help implement prescribed fire. Wildlife management associations, where contiguous or nearby properties all manage for the same wildlife to increase their impact on that species. Could be cattlemen or cattlewomen's organizations. All across the board, these groups are landowners forming local groups to help each other. These groups also are able to most effectively advocate in your community to those county commissioners' boards, to those cities, etc. Then, we have our local groups, and then we have these state and national associations and advocacy groups as well, right? And so these professional and advocacy groups, their goal is really focused on, providing for their members education, professional development, networking, and advocacy, right? I mean, Native Prairie's Association, right? They're putting this on as part to provide education and professional development to their membership, right? That's It's open to the public, but it's also a perk of being a member. Um, and all these groups, they might have regional chapters. Again, Fayette Prairie chapter of the Native Prairies Association, but they also have I would assume they have an annual meeting somewhere, and all the chapters get together, and all the members get together, and they start cross-pollinating ideas, and they learn from each other's experiences and what's going on and what's working well. Um, this could even be something like the Texas Section Society for Range Management, Texas Wildlife Association, Texas Farm Bureau, right? These are all groups that have a specific purpose in working together and advocating for what they for their discipline. And oftentimes their annual meetings are a ton of fun too. I mean, let's be real. And the last one I would talk about is just these volunteer groups, right? So the first ones were really focused on the professional development, the education, the ways to engage with knowledge and resources and community. And I think, to me, the difference between those and these volunteer groups is really it's the focus on giving back, right? So like Texas Master Naturalists, Texas Master Gardeners, I used to be an advisor for both. And, the goal for those volunteers is to go out and to educate, right? And to share knowledge and to provide examples of what good management could look like and teach people how to do that in their home, garden, land, etc. Could also be, your local city, your cities Keep Texas Beautiful chapter. I was the co-president of the Keep Anna Beautiful committee up in Anna, Texas for a couple of years, and it was a blast. We did trash cleanup, but we also put in pocket prairies, and we did lots of beautification around the city, and it was a ton of fun, right? Most cities also have parks boards and other ways to get involved and to, not just provide a service to your community and to your city, but also to advocate for good management, right? When we were putting pocket prairies in the city of Anna, yes, it was pretty, but we were also putting them in the areas that were really hard to mow or would otherwise have, be a hassle to manage. And we were putting them in with part of that purpose being to reduce the labor costs of maintaining certain areas, right? If we don't have to maintain it as a, Bermuda grass yard and mow it all the time, and we manage it as a prairie, well, that can save the city money, right? And save me, the taxpayer, some dollars as well. Texas Parks and Wildlife has volunteers. There's many ways to get involved, but I think for those of us who enjoy volunteering and have a heart for it, I always encourage people, don't be afraid to seek those out too. So overall, I'm only 11 minutes. Well, I'm not over at all because I was going till 7:30. But some final takeaways before we go into general Q&A or anything else, right? I think finding good information can be hard, but it is critical for our success, right? And not just good information, but knowing what we need to learn and how we can find that information to grow from. When in doubt, be skeptical, ask questions, verify claims, all that fun stuff. You got a lot of groups, organizations, and agencies in your community who can provide you with information, services, or assistance. I would say get as involved as you would like to be. But take advantage of the opportunities to learn, network, and meet other landowners and folks in your field and area, to the degree that you want. But I would encourage people, don't be afraid to go out and make friends. And just oftentimes, if you're not sure who to call, sometimes your county agent can be a really good person to just kind of start that with. All right, so with that, any questions? And I'm going to leave this here up on my screen so you can see my email in case you need it. All right, and I am able to keep this up and look at the chat. So I saw Marv asked, is there a resource list summarizing the specialization of each agency? Yes, there is. And actually, here, I can copy a link to it. Can I drop a file in this? I might be able to drop a file PDF. Either way, I'll put a link in there, or if you type up If you go into Google and type in AgriLife Extension New Landowner Resource Guide, that should get you to it. And what that is, and I showed that first page earlier in the presentation, but I really tried to keep it short, but it's just basically about 2 pages front and back. And it's just a laundry list of different agencies and what they do, right? Each of them, they all had like, I tried to keep myself to 3 sentences, but just a really short blurb of who they are, what they do, how to find your local office is really the focus of that. So I hope that answers that question. Another one, does the National Agricultural Statistics Service collect 1D1 statistics? No, because they're part of the USDA, and the USDA has nothing to do with the 1D1 ag valuation. For the 1D1 statistics, the best source for that would be the Texas Land Trends focus from. Oh, thank you, Tim. You just saved me a little bit of work. I appreciate that. But Texas Land Trends is a product that is put out semi-regularly from the Texas Natural Resources Institute. It's also affiliated with Texas A&M and AgriLife Extension. And that would be, honestly, that's the best point to really talk through, or that walks you through the where are we at in 1D1, acres, communities, things like that. If you want to get down to it, I think they also have an online explorer and a web tool that you can go in and look up by county what that looks like. So good question though. And then what about the WHF? I am not immediately familiar with the WHF, but I'm going to close this. And then I'm going to click on the link. Yeah. So WHF, Wildlife Habitat Federation. That's what that's short for. Okay, I have heard of that. So the Wildlife Habitat Federation. Yeah. I mean, that's on a group, right? Or a professional and conservationist organization. Absolutely. Yeah, and I will also say there is a profession. I'm a big believer. There's a professional association for just about anything you can think of. I remember vividly, this was probably 4 years ago. I was driving out back when I lived in Anna, Texas. I was driving through the Walmart and I stopped for a bag of ice. And I saw on the side of the ice machine that they were a member of the Texas Ice Makers Association. And so it's like there is a professional trade or industry group for anything you can imagine. And I think one of the nice things about that is it lets you find your people, right? You might find that, the Wildlife Habitat Federation, maybe that, you like their Kool-Aid better than another group. That's fine, right? I'm a firm believer both the associations as well as you as an individual do the best and succeed the most where you feel that sense of you belonging. And I know that might sound kind of cheesy, but really it is. I mean, if you don't, if you're among your people, you're going to have a better time. If you have a better time, you're going to be more involved and invested, which means you're going to build those better social connections and networks, which then means you have more people to go to for help and to ask questions. And, and it kind of snowballs into this positive feedback mechanism.
And I'll just jump in and say, all the people that we've interacted with around our restoration efforts that from all these agencies that you've mentioned, every one of them provided something really valuable to us. And we were just amazed when we started this project how these resources are available to us for free. And these people, like you said, this is their job to help landowners. And that's just such an amazing thing to have in the world. And I just wondered, we've got a few minutes here. I'm wondering if anybody wants to share an experience they've had with someone from these agencies or something on your property that you found really helpful. How did that go?
Honey, I think in addition to the agencies that many people have found just that the value of, like Chase was saying earlier, the value of that one-on-one in-person conversations, whether it's with the agencies or in conjunction with just other landowners. I think, again, to Chase's point of when we have these in person and on Zoom, it's just a little bit harder to get to know people when you're at these places and you're going to the back table to get a cookie and you meet up with someone else and find that you have something on your property that you share or that you have in common and can share your experience or and not just the Pinterest view, but the challenges that we all share and with no judgment. I think that local um, relationships are just super helpful.
Yeah, it meant a lot to us just in organizations like Native Prairie Association and Texas Master Naturalist, meeting other landowners who were further further down the path than we were, and who would just generously invite us over and give us a tour of their property and talk to us about how things had gone for them, what they've learned, what they would have done differently. That was hugely valuable.
Yeah, and I saw some questions in the chat, and I'm actually going to jump on those in just a sec. But I also want to, before I do that, I want to jump on what, especially what you were saying, Connie, too, about having people come out and look and bring the experts to your property. I know I said it, but man, that is some of the most fun I've had working in extension was doing farm visits. And especially, again, when I was in Collin County, I worked really closely with our NRCS office and SWCD. And when we would coordinate field visits, and so someone would call for a farm visit, and we would all basically clown car into the federal pickup truck, and we would all show up, and like 7 of us would pour out of this little pickup truck. And I mean, and they got 7 expert opinions. Not that we disagreed, but we just covered so many different disciplines that we had an expert for every question right there. And it's a ton of fun. We'd go do 2 or 3 of those and then get lunch and then knock out another 1 or 2 in the afternoon. And I still talk with some of my NRCS colleagues about that. And we reminisce like how much fun it was, because it is. And so then going in order of what I saw it. So Kurt Walker had a great comment about using AI as a resource as well, right? And AI can be a very powerful tool. I think he also made a really good point in, it make sure you clarify, give suggestions to your AI agent where, some examples of where to pull from. AI can be an really powerful tool, but I think that goes into the, trust but verify, right? Sometimes, we can give AI instructions, and in the absence of better, if there is, it will find you an answer, period, right? And generally speaking, if we're not careful, sometimes if there is no answer to be had, it will make one up. That's not always very common. I'm not saying it's constantly the case, but it is good. Like, hey, if it's when I ask, Chat GPT, or when I type into Google and they give that AI summary of answering a question, I always like to kind of look at the links and where it's pulling from and just kind of get an idea of like, okay, cool, this is where it's coming from, and then that helps me connect the dots of how is that AI agent pulling that response together. But yeah, I mean, go for it. I would also, let's see, Steve, do other states have the same resources that Texas does for landowners? I'm going to give you the extension answer of it depends. And as one of my college professors put it in my range ecology class, it depends is always the right answer, but it's not the one you can use on your exam. And so generally speaking, other states do, right? Now, how that looks at the local level will vary. Right. So every state has a cooperative extension service. Every state has USDA offices, et cetera. But at the ground level, maybe the NRCS has different programs, or their program priorities are different in Minnesota than they are in Texas. Or Texas is kind of old school. We have a county extension office that covers every single county, and county agents are in that county. South Dakota State University Extension they don't have county extension agents. They have more of a hub and spoke model where they centralize a lot of those agents and specialists, who then cover a larger region instead of having county-based staff. So it varies. Um, but it is generally similar, if, even if the flavor of it is kind of different. So both the good comments and questions for sure. Also, don't feel like you have to limit yourself to just resources and information questions. You are welcome to ask me land management or anything else as well. And if you ask me a really hard question, I might just tell you I don't know, or maybe I just don't know the answer, but that's okay too.
Well, that is a lot to take in, Chase.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
there's one thing you get really good at in this job, it's talking.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that, I think that it is comforting to know that there are so many people out there that really, not only is it their job, but they genuinely enjoy the help, um, and visiting and sharing what they know. And I found that, as Connie said, that is really just the typical experience that most of us have had of, if they don't know, they will direct you. And the networking is just endless and very encouraging. So I appreciate this. Does anyone else have any questions they want to throw out there before we close? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Chase. And I know that we're really looking forward to the third installment of this series. And if anyone would like to share the link with other people who were unable to attend, oh, it looks like Kurt
Oh, he
might
did.
have another question.
Yeah. Ooh, he slipped in at right at the
I
last call.
know.
Good
Good
job,
job,
Kurt.
Kurt.
Yeah, he asked basically if he wants to plant native grasses, is it better to go from a potted plant or seed with really well drained? I'm going to interpret that as sandy as heck soils in the piney woods, and wanting to start planting native grasses. I will say again, it depends. I think if you want to have native grasses now, starting with potted plants can work. Usually seed is expensive, but it's still cheap. It's kind of like if you're establishing a yard, seed is cheaper than sod, right? As just a general idea. That being said, there are some ways I think, like as a frugal landowner myself, the way I would approach that is I would start off by saying get some good seed blends. Just to have, so you have good genetics and you're having good variety, and it basically helps make sure that you're getting the variety of seeds that you're looking for your plant community. Any of the major native seed dealers can get you hooked up with a mix appropriate for your area. I would say with that, there are a couple things to try. You can buy native plants, sure. If you have an area of your property that has a good native plant community, maybe that's getting a sharpshooter and just doing some manual transplanting. I'm also a big believer, buy the seed to bring in the genetics. But if you have a couple areas of native grass that you really like, or someone who is willing to let you do this, I'm a big believer in getting like a cheap $20 gas powered lawnmower off Craigslist. Put the grass clipping bag on it, clean it out so you don't have Bermuda grass seed or anything in it. Put the grass clipping bag on the back, or the clipping collection bag. And then wherever there's a really good patch of native plants that are going to seed, push that mower through it and collect all the seed and the plant clippings. Then go dump them where you want those plants to grow. It's poor man's seed source. Now you run the risk of getting unwanted plants and stuff mixed in with it. That's up to you to judge if that's worth it. But I would say the main issue I have with transplanting is just like any transplant. I don't care if it's tomatoes or sodding your yard. They just require a little more love and care to keep alive at first, because transplanting is very much a shock to the plant system. And especially trying to transplant a big, healthy native plant, or even a weak one, it just takes some TLC to keep it alive and going. So, hope that answers your question a little bit. Yeah, and there you go for the native plant sale coming up. Excellent opportunity, and really, I think, like everything else, a little bit of all of the above tends to be a good answer. But yeah, good question, Kurt, and a great way to finish it off.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And you will get an email for the July presentation. Be sure to share it, and you can go back and watch the recordings on our website. And we appreciate everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all very much, and I'll see y'all in July.
All right. Good night.